Hello, good morning, and good afternoon, my future chef friends. Welcome to this month's episode of Fresh for Kids. The recipe that we are making this time around is very delicious and pretty easy. It's actually a pretty short recipe too, not a ton of prep work. So I think that you will really enjoy this. And like most of the recipes that I select for all of us to make, this one is fairly open to interpretation as well. So I'm going to tell you the ingredients that I'm using today, but you can feel free to play around with those a little bit if you should desire. So we are making this time around pizza. I had you at pizza, right? Pizza stuffed mushrooms. They are so delicious. I actually made these at home just about a week ago, and everybody really enjoyed them. Mushrooms are one of those ingredients that are fairly easy to find year-round since they don't rely on outside temperatures or weather patterns for you to be able to grow them. Most of them are grown indoors, and they're grown in all 50 states. I'll have some more fun mushroom facts for you later on, but let's get started with everything that you are going to need to make these pizza stuffed mushrooms yourself. Of course, you know you're going to need mushrooms. I'm using portobello mushrooms, the kind of medium-sized variety. There are some, of course, that are much smaller, and then there are some that are much larger that are excellent for grilling or making like mushroom steaks. But these actually say right on the package, stuffing mushrooms. So these are the perfect size. The recipe that I'm using calls for about 12 to 15 mushrooms, but since I'm just making them here, I'm not making a full recipe size of them. So we will need those mushrooms, like I said, about 12 to 15. Now, when I did purchase them to make them at home, they only had one of these 6-packs, so I did 6 of the medium size, and then I did 2 of the larger size. But you know, whichever you prefer. The smaller ones are just a little bit easier, and this makes a really great appetizer or a small snack, so you don't necessarily need the really extra large ones. But in addition to our mushrooms, we will of course need sauce, because of course it's pizza, you gotta have tomato sauce in there. And this, you could, whatever is your favorite kind of tomato sauce or pizza sauce, definitely feel free to use that. When I made them at home, we used a homemade tomato sauce, but the Publix brand is really quite delicious and very economical. We will need cheese. The recipe called for mozzarella, but I do like the Italian blend because it's got a couple other kinds of white cheeses in there that are very delicious. And little teeny tiny pepperonis. But if you don't eat meat, of course, you can just leave those off. Maybe there's something else that you really enjoy having on your pizza. Maybe it's anchovies. You could definitely use anchovies. We used just diced up white onions on ours at home, added just a little bit of extra flavor. And you will need some basil, and we're just going to put that on at the very end once they are finished cooking for a little bit of freshness, brightness with the recipe. And then just for seasoning, some garlic powder and a little bit of salt and pepper. Now the cutting board I have out just to make it a little bit easier to work on this surface, but we actually aren't going to be cutting anything at all today. Like I said, this is a fairly simple recipe from a preparation standpoint. We are going to use a skillet. At home we used a cast iron skillet, but I don't know if you've ever picked up a cast iron skillet. They're quite heavy, and I really did not want to tote that all the way to and from the library. So I'm just using a non-stick skillet. Just makes cleanup time much easier, and I will spray it with a little bit of cooking spray. Now be sure, because we are using the oven, we're not using our stovetop, make sure whatever skillet or pan that you decide to use to make your mushrooms, you want to make sure that it is oven safe. I just like using the skillet because it's really easy to remove it because you've got that perfect handle right on there. So here's everything that we need to get started. I'll let you gather your ingredients, and when we come back, we'll start putting these beautiful mushrooms together. Hello there, we are back. First things first, make sure that you have preheated your oven to 450 degrees. It's a pretty high temperature, but the mushrooms are raw, and nothing that we are putting in here is super delicate, and we want it to cook at very high temperature very quickly. So because these are a little bit of a larger mushroom, if they were tiny ones, they might not need as long, or they may not need quite as high of a temperature. But to get everything together and get our cheese ooey and gooey, 450 is the temperature we are looking for. So you're gonna take your mushrooms, and of course I have rinsed these off very thoroughly. Definitely want to make sure, mushrooms especially, because of the types of things that they are grown in, you want to make sure that they are very, very clean. Just a good rinsing and then let them drain. You never want to soak mushrooms in any kind of liquid because they are kind of like little sponges. They absorb everything. And once they have absorbed a bunch of water or any other liquid, they just don't taste quite as good. Another thing about mushrooms is they do not lend well to freezing. So you want to make sure whenever you do buy fresh mushrooms, you want to use them pretty much right away. So all I did is I just reached in there and I pinched off the stem that was on the inside. They've cut them down fairly short for stuffing mushrooms. So then we're just going to put them in our pre-sprayed skillet. So yeah, just there's the bottom, there's our stem. Just kind of reach in, pinch and turn, and it pulls right off very easily. So we're going to continue that. Got those in our pan. We can get rid of that. The cool thing about mushrooms, I don't know, you may have already known this and maybe you don't, but mushrooms are neither plants or animals. What? How is that possible, you ask? Well, that's because they are a fungus, or a fungi, if you're speaking in plurals. It's a fun word to say. So they are, quite different. They have a very unique life cycle that is unlike any other plant that you may already be familiar with. They start off as spores, and then those spores turn into kind of a lacy sort of film that is called mycelium. It's usually white, very, very light in color, and from those kind of strands, and they are very pretty. If you have never seen it before, definitely look up a picture of them. That is what the mushrooms grow from. That mycelium stays underneath the whatever soil, compost. There's so many different growing mediums for mushrooms, but the mycelium will be underneath that, and then the mushrooms stem from there. So it's kind of very cool and unique. And another really cool thing about mushrooms, I did not know this until I looked up some fun facts about mushrooms, that human DNA is closer to mushrooms than it is any other kind of plant. That's very cool. So now we've got some fun facts. We've got our mushrooms prepared and ready to go. So now you're just going to take whatever sauce you're using, whether it's something that you made at home or something you bought at the store, and we're just going to scoop in, depends on the size of your mushrooms, maybe about a tablespoon or so. Just fill up that opening there where we've taken the stem out. And again, these bigger mushrooms will hold a little more sauce. It's kind of just a cool little mushroom bowl full of pizza sauce. Last one. And then of course you're going to have plenty of leftover sauce that you can use for a different recipe. All right, so what's next? Next, I'm going to sprinkle on a little bit of garlic powder, just a little. And it's good that it's going underneath the cheese, because if we had this just on the surface, it might burn a little bit at that 450-degree temperature, but since we're gonna have cheese over top of it, it will be perfectly fine. And at this point, you could add a little bit of salt and pepper. Very light. Just a little salt, just enough to bring out those natural flavors of the mushrooms. And then we're just gonna take a pinch of cheese, put it on top. Oh, I do love cheese. So yummy, so good for you. Filled with lots of good stuff, calcium, vitamin D. Another really cool fact about mushrooms that I just learned is that they can be fortified with vitamin D, certain kinds of mushrooms, if they are exposed to ultraviolet light. And remember, mushrooms do not need any source of light to grow, but if you do expose them to ultraviolet light, it will be a catalyst for vitamin D to fortify those mushrooms. So that's another thing that you can look for wherever you buy your produce. Just look to see if they have any vitamin D fortified mushrooms. All right, so now we're gonna put on our cute, teeny tiny little pepperonis. And the reason why we're putting the pepperoni on top is because it gets crispy and delicious when it's on top of that cheese. If we put it underneath, it sort of gets lost and doesn't get that yummy, crispy texture that you get from a traditional piece of pepperoni on your pizza. But the pepperoni is fully cooked, so it's totally safe to do it either way. And you can even eat it right out of the bag. All right, a couple more pieces of pepperoni. All right, they look really, really awesome. I don't know if you can see it. I don't want to turn the pan too much because I don't want to lose any of my ingredients, but this is ready to go. As soon as my oven hits 450 degrees, I'm gonna put these in for about 15 to 18 minutes. I'm definitely gonna check it at the 15-minute mark to make sure my cheese is bubbling and delicious. That's just a matter of personal preference, how done you want your cheese to be on the top. It's like I said, everything is totally edible, whether it is cooked or not. So we don't have to worry about getting to any internal temperature like you would with a lot of proteins. So as soon as my oven's ready, I'm gonna pop these in, check it at 15 minutes, and then we will be back. We will add our finishing touch of basil, fresh basil on top before we eat them. So we'll be back in just a little bit so you can see how delicious they are when they are finished. So while we are waiting for those mushrooms, we have a few more minutes left to go. I'm gonna fill you in on a couple other really fun mushroom facts that I haven't told you yet. So another thing about mushrooms that's really cool is that it takes science to grow mushrooms. The environment that they need to be grown in is very, very specific to each individual variety of mushroom. So there's a lot of work that goes into growing a big crop of mushrooms. They each need different amounts of heat, humidity, and airflow. And speaking of airflow, one thing to keep in mind when you purchase mushrooms, if you don't eat all of them or cook all of them right away, don't store them in plastic bags or plastic containers. They need to have some kind of airflow going through them. So if you do need to keep them in the original container that is not covered in plastic, or easiest way to make sure that they stay delicious is to put them just in a plain brown paper bag. Another thing, I know I mentioned earlier that mushrooms are definitely capable of being grown in all 50 of our United States. But one thing that's really interesting is that I learned today 63% of all the white mushrooms that are grown in the US are grown in the state of Pennsylvania. which is quite interesting. Another really wonderful fact about mushrooms is they are so safe and gentle to our planet. They are one of the most sustainable, actually I believe they are the most sustainable food that can be grown ever. Yes, one of the most sustainably produced food sources in the United States. It says it right there. It's got to be true. So, like I said, they can be grown indoors. So, 1 acre of mushrooms can produce 1 million pounds of mushrooms in 1 year. That's pretty remarkable. Also, the medium that you grow them in, whether it's some sort of compost, there are so many cool things that they can be grown in. Cocoa husks, corn, straw, oats, they can be grown in any or all of those things. So once you have grown a crop of mushrooms in that growing medium can then be composted and used for something else. So it's a really great way to recycle the growing medium, and they require much, much less water than any other type of fruit or vegetable that is grown. About a little bit less than 2 gallons of water will grow a full gallon of mushrooms. So by comparison to the amount of water that you need to grow pretty much any other fruit or vegetable, that is just a fraction of the amount of water that you would use for anything else, which is really great. And I did mention they are neither plants nor animals, but fungi, and some really cool facts about fungi, other than the fact that they are genetically closer to humans than plants are, which I find really very cool. They can be used as a natural pesticide. The spores that they release can be harmful or deadly to many common insects that you might find in your yard, which is really great because a lot of store-bought pesticides are full of chemicals that are very, very bad for water supply once they go into the ground in your yard. Another really cool thing, I don't know if you knew this or not, but trees can talk to each other. And the way they talk to each other is by that mycelium that we talked about earlier that grows underneath the ground. It connects basically anything. If they're grown in a forest environment, it allows all of the nature and all of the trees in that area to be connected to each other and get information about the type of nutrients that are in the soil, the amount of water that's in the soil, weather patterns, all kinds of really interesting things. And if you've ever wondered what is the absolute most expensive, fabulous mushroom ever, it is called the Yartsa gunbu, and it is also called a caterpillar fungus. And the reason why it's called that is because it is a parasite fungus, and it grows from the host caterpillar. It grows out of that caterpillar's head. That's crazy. I've never heard anything like that, but it's true. So they're very rare and they're very expensive. Do you care to wager on how much you think a full pound of these caterpillar head mushrooms cost? They cost $50,000 for a pound, or $2,000 for 1 tiny ounce of those mushrooms. I don't know what they taste like, but for that much money, they better be pretty good. If you would like some really interesting mushrooms that you will not find at your local Publix, if you are right here in Maitland, there's a fellow that runs a booth over at the farmer's market on Sundays, and he sells really, really fantastically delicious mushrooms. They are definitely more expensive than what you're going to find at Publix, but totally worth it. Very, very good. I hope you enjoyed these fun facts, and our mushrooms are going to be coming out in just a couple of minutes, so I will see you back once I have them out here so you can see how beautiful they are. They are finished, and they are what I like to call GBD, golden brown delicious. Yep, I got that cheese to just the perfect color. I left them in for exactly the 15 minutes. But again, every oven cooks a little bit differently, so if it's not quite brown enough for you, just leave them in there for just a couple more minutes, but keep a watchful eye. So last step in this process, we are going to add some basil. And here's the thing that I learned just recently that's very interesting about basil, really almost any kind of herb. The flavor comes from the oils that are inside those herbs. So what happens when you cut it on a cutting board is that as you are pushing down with that knife and cutting through, you are leaving the majority of the oils that create the flavors on your cutting board. So the most efficient way to get all of the flavor out of your basil is just to tear it with your hands and then sprinkle it on top. Nice little benefit to that is then your hands smell lovely like basil once you are finished. So I am just going to take a few pieces here. And of course you want to make sure you rinse it really well. I'm just going to tear it. Just sprinkle it right on top. It's what they call in the restaurant industry rustic, which is just kind of a nice way for saying it doesn't look perfect. Totally fine. It tastes delicious. Trust me. Right? Just tear those pieces, and maybe you're not a fan of basil. Not everybody loves it. So you can skip this step if it's not your jam. Right. And voila, they are beautiful. And they smell so great. I hope you have a wonderful time creating your very own version of pizza stuffed mushrooms. And won't you please share a picture of them once you finish making them. We would love to see it. We will see you next month here at the Maitland Public Library on Fresh for Kids. Bye.